Ethan Grayson opened the door of La Lumiere, Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurant, with the confidence of a man who had spent years as one of the most successful CEOs in the financial sector. He adjusted the Rolex on his wrist as he held the door for Vanessa Carter, his new girlfriend. Vanessa, a model frequently gracing magazine covers, entered with the same air of superiority Ethan had come to both admire and tolerate. The ambiance was dazzling, as always. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, their light reflecting softly across the impeccably set tables. The aroma of truffle butter and French wine lingered in the air. It was a setting designed to impress, and Ethan always chose settings like this. "It's perfect," Vanessa murmured, sliding her delicate fingers along Ethan's arm. She looked stunning in a red dress that seemed sculpted to her body. He smiled, not out of any genuine feeling, but because it was what was expected of him. Her presence at his side was just another piece of the puzzle that made up his public image. They were led to a central table, strategically positioned to be noticed, but not excessively exposed. Vanessa began talking about next week's charity gala, something about raising funds for an environmental cause. Ethan wasn't paying attention. It wasn't the lack of interest in the conversation. It was that something in his peripheral vision had caught his attention. A waitress moved swiftly across the room, balancing a tray loaded with elegant dishes. Ethan froze. He recognized that face, the deep brown eyes, the soft features, unmistakable, even from a distance. Clara Bennett, his ex-wife. But it wasn't just the shock of seeing her in a place he frequented so often that unsettled him. It was her condition. Beneath the black apron of her uniform, her noticeably swollen belly showed that she was pregnant. Very pregnant. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan felt his stomach churn, but his expression remained controlled. Vanessa, busy adjusting the menu in front of her, didn't notice the sudden shift in his demeanor. "Ethan!" Vanessa's voice carried a note of irritation. He tore his gaze away from Clara just in time to avoid suspicion. "Sorry, what did you say?" he asked, feigning attention. "I was saying the Vogue photographer wants to do a couple's shoot with us. Brilliant idea, don't you think?" He nodded automatically, but her words didn't register. While Vanessa kept talking, he stole quick glances at Clara. She looked different from the woman he once knew. There was something about her posture, weary yet resilient, but deeply unsettled him. He remembered her as quiet and reserved, almost invisible amidst his life of meetings, business dinners, and international trips. And now, there she was, just a few feet away, carrying a child. He needed answers. When Clara returned from the back of the restaurant with a bottle of wine for another table, she finally saw him. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and the impact was like an electric shock. She nearly dropped the bottle, but quickly recovered, turning toward the table she was serving, head held high. Ethan didn't miss a single movement. "I'm going to the restroom," he muttered to Vanessa, who didn't even look up. Clara was heading to the opposite side of the restaurant when Ethan intercepted her, stepping directly into her path. She stopped abruptly, the tray in her hands almost slipping. "Clara," he said, his voice low but tense. She stared at him, her brown eyes darkening with a mix of surprise and caution. "Mr. Grayson," she replied formally, her tone neutral. "Don't treat me like a stranger," he shot back, his gaze dropping pointedly to her belly. "Is that what I think it is?" Clara straightened her shoulders, gripping the tray firmly in her hands. "I don't know what you think, Ethan." "Don't play games with me," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "You're pregnant. Why am I finding out about this now?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for a rehearsed response. "My current condition has nothing to do with you," she said evenly. "This is absurd," he replied, struggling to keep his anger in check. "If this baby is mine, I have a right to know." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "This isn't a conversation we should be having here," she said, her voice quieter now. Before he could respond, she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. Ethan returned to the table, but his mind was miles away. Vanessa was now busy taking selfies, seemingly content to ignore his mood. But Ethan couldn't ignore it. Clara was pregnant, and he needed to know whose baby it was and why she had kept it from him. The sound of footsteps echoed in the silence of Ethan Grayson's penthouse apartment. He stood by the window, staring out at Manhattan's glowing skyline, though his thoughts were far from the view. He held a glass of whiskey in his hand, the ice clinking softly. The image of Clara, pregnant and working as a waitress in a luxury restaurant, wouldn't leave his mind. She had disappeared from his life 5 months ago. Clara had always been pragmatic, even when ending their marriage. There had been no shouting matches or heated arguments, just a sharp silence as she signed the divorce papers and walked out the door. At the time, he'd thought it was exactly what he wanted: freedom to focus on his career, free of distractions or emotional entanglements. But now he wasn't so sure. He turned the phone over in his hand, hesitating for a moment before searching for Clara's number. He knew he still had it. He had never deleted it. Pressing call, he listened as the line rang several times before going to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Ethan hated being ignored, but Clara had always had a way of throwing him off balance. Meanwhile, Clara sat in her small apartment in Queens, exhausted after her shift. She sank carefully onto the couch, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The baby moved and she smiled, a small, genuine gesture, before closing her eyes and letting out a long sigh. Seeing Ethan that night had been a shock, but she had known it would happen eventually. He was a man who always had control, who never let anything slip through his fingers. Seeing the surprise and confusion on his face when he noticed her pregnancy had almost made her laugh. Almost. But the pain was still too raw, the hurt too deep. Clara thought back to how things had fallen apart between them. Ethan was consumed by his career, every second of his life devoted to expanding his company, Grayson Capital. At first, she had admired his ambition, but over time she realized she would always come second. Or perhaps she was never truly part of his priorities at all. They lived in different worlds. She wanted a family, but he had made her feel as though that was an absurd idea. One particular night still haunted her memory. They were having dinner at home, a rare moment together, and she had casually brought up her desire to have children. Ethan had frozen, his fork hovering mid-air as he looked at her with skepticism. "Children, Clara? You know how destructive that would be for us right now. My time is completely consumed, and you know Grayson Capital demands all of my focus." She never brought up the subject again. The idea of having children with Ethan felt as impossible as trying to change the course of a river with her bare hands. So when she found out she was pregnant, it felt like a cruel twist of fate. Their marriage was already hanging by a thread, and she knew Ethan wouldn't see the pregnancy as a blessing, only another complication. Instead of telling him, she made the hardest decision of her life: to leave. Now, as she rested on the couch, her phone buzzed beside her. She glanced at the screen. It was a number she knew all too well: Ethan. She ignored the call, squeezing her eyes shut as if that could block out the storm of emotions he still stirred in her. The following day, Ethan strode into his office with his usual decisive gait, but his mind was far from composed. He walked right past his assistant Megan, who tried to catch his attention to go over the day's agenda. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop and began digging for information. It didn't take long to find the basics about Clara: her address in Queens, the name of the restaurant where she worked. But it was something else that stopped him in his tracks. A file detailing the terms of their divorce revealed something he had somehow overlooked before. Clara hadn't asked for a single thing from him. Not a portion of his fortune, not financial support, nothing. He remembered her words the day they signed the papers: "I just want to move on, Ethan." At the time, he had taken it as a relief, but now he couldn't make sense of it. Why hadn't she asked for anything? And why, after everything, did she seem so determined to keep him out of her life? Later that evening, Ethan decided it was time to confront her. He showed up at the restaurant near closing time, seating himself at one of the tables in the back. Clara spotted him immediately, her heart racing as she recognized him. She tried to ignore his presence, but she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. When she finally approached the table, Ethan looked at her with the same intensity that always made her feel vulnerable and irritated. "Can we talk now?" he asked bluntly. "I'm working, Ethan," she replied, her tone firm. "I'll wait," he said, crossing his arms. "I'm not leaving without answers." After a long pause, Clara relented. When the restaurant finally closed, she met Ethan outside on the sidewalk. The streetlights cast soft shadows around them, amplifying the tension between them. "What do you want to know?" she asked, crossing her arms defensively. Why didn't you tell me? About the baby? Clara took a deep breath. Because you never wanted children, Ethan. It didn't make sense to bring a child into a marriage that was already falling apart. His brow furrowed. That wasn't your decision to make alone. She held his gaze, her voice steady. And what would you have done? Stayed out of guilt, or worse, insisted that I not have the baby? Her voice cracked slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. I didn't want this child to grow up in an environment where they weren't wanted. Ethan stood silent. For the first time, he had no immediate response. Her words struck him in a way he hadn't expected. And yet, anger bubbled beneath the surface. Not at her, but at himself. Because deep down, he knew she was right. I deserve to know, he said finally. You took that from me. Clara looked at him for a long moment before replying. You deserved many things, Ethan, but this child deserved even more. Without another word, she turned and entered her building, leaving him alone on the sidewalk, his mind swirling with more questions than answers. Ethan Grayson couldn't sleep. His conversation with Clara replayed in his head like a relentless mantra, each word from her stirring his conscience. He wasn't the kind of man who admitted fault, much less accepted being excluded from something as significant as the existence of a child. But Clara's words, filled with conviction and pain, made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. What unsettled him most, though, wasn't the pregnancy itself. It was the fact that she believed he wasn't capable of being a father. Was that true? He had never given it much thought. Children were a concept he had always treated as a someday possibility, something for the future, when life was perfect. But that someday had never come. And now, reality was hitting him like a punch to the gut. He got out of bed and went to his office, his sanctuary for clarity. Opening his laptop, he began searching for family law attorneys. Ethan didn't know exactly how to navigate this situation, but he was certain of one thing. He wanted to be part of the baby's life, whether Clara liked it or not. At the restaurant, Clara was wrapping up another grueling shift. Since her confrontation with Ethan, she had felt an additional weight on her shoulders, as if something inevitable was on the horizon. Lucas Harper, the restaurant's manager, noticed her tension as he helped her clean the tables. Clara, are you okay? He asked gently. She hesitated before replying, I'm fine, just dealing with some things. Lucas didn't press, but his concern was clear. He knew Clara was pregnant and had always respected her space, but at that moment, he wanted to offer more. If you ever need help, you know you can count on me. Clara gave him a small, tired smile. Thank you, Lucas. You already do more than enough. Lucas was the opposite of Ethan, patient, empathetic, and attentive. He didn't know the details of Clara's past, but he suspected it involved pain she was trying to leave behind. Still, he understood he couldn't force her trust. Clara was resilient, but even the strongest people needed support. Ethan started showing up at the restaurant more frequently, a habit Clara found both infuriating and exhausting. He always chose a discreet table, but his gaze never left her. It unsettled not only Clara, but also Lucas, who watched Ethan's movements with quiet suspicion. One night, Ethan called Clara over to his table after dinner. I don't want to keep doing this, he began, his voice calm but laced with determination. I want to be part of this. Clara scoffed, crossing her arms. Part of this? Ethan, you don't even know what that means. What you want is control, like always. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to hold back his frustration. I can learn, Clara. I want to learn. But you need to let me. She stared at him for a long moment before responding. Learning isn't enough. This isn't something you can control or delegate, Ethan. Being a parent takes more than that. Before he could respond, Lucas appeared beside them. Is everything okay here? He asked, his voice calm, but with an undertone of protectiveness. It was clear he didn't appreciate Ethan's presence. It's fine, Lucas, Clara said quickly, hoping to end the conversation. But Ethan, noticing Lucas's interest in Clara, couldn't help himself. And who are you? Ethan asked, standing up. His stance was defensive, his eyes narrowed. Lucas didn't flinch. I'm the manager here, and I'm making sure Clara isn't being bothered. Clara stepped between them before the tension could escalate. Enough, Ethan. Just go. Ethan hesitated, his jaw tight. but finally grabbed his coat and left the restaurant. Yet, the seed of doubt had been planted. Who was Lucas to Clara? Was there something between them? The thought irritated him more than he wanted to admit. A few days later, the situation took an unexpected turn. Ethan hired a private investigator to learn more about Clara. What he uncovered left him stunned. She had turned down a high-paying job offer at a local company because she didn't want any ties to him. She was saving every penny to ensure the baby's future, even if it meant working long, grueling shifts. But the most shocking revelation came at the end of the report. Ethan discovered that Clara had visited a fertility specialist a year before their divorce. She had been trying to get pregnant while they were still married. The information shook him. She had wanted a child during their marriage. That contradicted everything he had believed. Ethan realized with a sinking feeling that he had never truly asked what Clara wanted in life. He had simply assumed she wanted what he did. He needed to confront her again, but this time, armed with the truth. Clara was walking home on a cold night when Ethan intercepted her at the entrance of her building. "I know about the fertility specialist," he said bluntly, his words slicing through the air like a blade. She froze, her heart racing. "You had no right to investigate my life." "I had every right," he countered. "Why didn't you tell me? Were you trying to have a child while we were still married?" Clara took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I wanted a child, Ethan. I wanted a family. But you made it very clear that it wasn't part of your plan. And yet, here you are, pregnant," he said, bitterness lacing his voice. "You made that decision for both of us." "No," she shot back, her voice steady. "I made that decision for myself and for this child, because I knew you would never understand." Ethan was momentarily at a loss for words. For the first time, he began to see the depth of the pain and loneliness Clara had endured during their marriage. But that didn't diminish the anger brewing within him, not just at her, but at himself. "I want to be a part of this," he finally said, his tone firm. "And I'm not giving up until you let me." Clara stared at him, exhaustion and determination etched into her face. "Then maybe you should start by learning what it really means to be present, Ethan, because words aren't enough." She turned and walked into the building, leaving him standing alone once again. But this time, something inside him had shifted. The icy Manhattan wind howled that night, scattering dried leaves along the sidewalks as Clara Bennett stepped off the subway, her pace slow and weary. Her days felt endless, split between grueling shifts at the restaurant and restless nights in her small apartment. But tonight, something felt off. A growing discomfort tightened in her belly, and the baby seemed unusually restless. When she arrived home, she collapsed onto the couch, trying to ignore the waves of pain that came and went. It was too soon for the baby to arrive. She still had almost 2 months to go, yet a deep instinct told her something wasn't right. Across the city, Ethan Grayson was in the middle of a business meeting, but his thoughts were on Clara. Since their last conversation, a sense of restlessness had taken hold of him, as if every decision he made was wrong. He wasn't a man who liked to fail, and the realization that he might have destroyed the only relationship that truly mattered gnawed at him. In the middle of the meeting, his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but something made him glance at the screen. It was an unknown number. Against his usual habits, he picked it up. "Mr. Grayson?" A woman's voice on the other end sounded urgent. "This is Jenna, Clara's neighbor. She's unwell and refusing to call an ambulance. I didn't know who else to call." Ethan shot to his feet, cutting off the meeting without an explanation. He sprinted out of the building, calling for his driver to get him to Clara's address as quickly as possible. When Ethan arrived, Clara was slumped on the couch, pale and struggling to breathe evenly. Lucas, her neighbor, was by her side, trying to convince her to go to the hospital. "Clara," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with concern. "You don't have a choice. We're going to the hospital now." She tried to protest, but another sharp wave of pain silenced her. Ethan didn't wait. He scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the car. Lucas hesitated, but Ethan shot him a look that left no room for argument. During the drive to the hospital, Clara was visibly panicking. "It's too soon, Ethan," she said, gripping his arm tightly. "What if something's wrong?" "Nothing's going to happen," he said, though his own heart was pounding. "I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Those words seemed to calm her, and she leaned back against the seat, finally letting herself rest. Hours later, Clara was rushed into the delivery room. Ethan stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement he didn't even know he was capable of. He saw the pain and effort in her eyes, and something inside him cracked, a wall he had spent years building. For the first time, he was completely present, with no distractions or excuses. Finally, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room, and Clara broke into tears of relief. The doctor announced it was a boy, healthy despite being born prematurely. Ethan looked at the tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket and felt an overwhelming surge of emotions he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. When they placed the baby in Clara's arms, she gazed at him with a love so pure that Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He moved closer, looking at the baby for the first time. "He has your eyes," Clara said softly, and Ethan smiled for the first time in months. In the weeks that followed, something began to shift. Ethan was determined to be part of Clara and the baby's life, not as the man he had been, but as someone better. He started restructuring his life, delegating more responsibilities at work so he could spend time with them. He drove Clara to her medical appointments, brought her anything she needed for the baby, and even learned how to change diapers, awkwardly at first, but with a focus that surprised them both. Clara, meanwhile, remained cautious. She saw Ethan's efforts, but she wasn't sure if she could fully trust him. Still, she couldn't deny the changes she saw. He was more patient, more open, and for the first time, he seemed to truly listen. The turning point came on a sunny afternoon when Ethan took Clara and the baby, now named Liam, to a park. While Clara rested on a bench, Ethan held Liam in his arms, rocking him gently. He looked down at his son's tiny face and for the first time felt a sense of completeness he had never experienced. "Clara," he said, turning to her, "I know I've made a lot of mistakes. I know you have every reason not to trust me, but I want you to know that I'll do whatever it takes. Not just for Liam, but for you, because you two are all that matter to me now." Clara was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Ethan and Liam. Finally, she spoke. "I believe in change, Ethan, but I can't promise anything. It's going to take time." He nodded, accepting her words as the start of something new. He knew earning back her trust wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to try, because for the first time, he understood what it meant to be a father, a partner, and most importantly, human. That evening, as Clara tucked Liam into bed, Ethan stood in the doorway, watching them with a quiet smile. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The story ended as it had begun, but with one crucial difference. Ethan was no longer trying to control the world around him. He was learning how to truly be part of it,